Okay, so today we're diving into some pretty deep waters. We're talking about confidence, influence, all that good stuff, but through the lens of, well, Robert Greene, the 48 Laws of Power guy.
Yeah, exactly. And what's really interesting is we're going beyond just, boardrooms and power suits here. We're actually going to be unpacking a really insightful interview Green did on, of all things, the Diary of a CEO podcast.
And he gets surprisingly personal, right? I mean, this is the guy who wrote the book on power, but he's also talking about vulnerability, even his own experience recovering from a stroke, which is pretty heavy stuff.
Yeah, it really makes you rethink this whole idea of what power really is. And I think one of the most fascinating things about Green is how he actually defines power.
It's not just about, like, being some ruthless manipulator, right?
Exactly. He sees it as an emotion, a sense of agency. It's more about controlling yourself than it is about controlling others.
Okay, that's interesting. So how does that actually work in practice? Because it's easy to say, oh, just be more self-aware, but what does that actually look like?
Well, Green actually has this great quote from Malcolm X that I think really gets to the heart of it. He says, absolute power corrupts, but absolute powerlessness corrupts even more.
Whoa. Okay, that's pretty powerful. It makes you think about those situations where you felt completely powerless and how that can actually be more damaging than, well, being the one in charge.
Exactly. And what's really interesting is how Green links this idea of power to, of all things, seduction.
Okay, now hold on a second. Seduction. Like, what does that have to do with, being a better leader or having more confidence? When I first heard that, I was definitely a little skeptical.
Yeah, I can see why. But I think it's important to understand how Green is actually using that word. He's not talking about manipulation or playing games. It's more about understanding someone else's perspective so deeply that they become receptive to your ideas.
Okay, so it's less about like pickup artist tricks and more about genuine connection.
Exactly. He makes this really important distinction between what he calls warm seduction versus cold seduction.
So warm seduction is more about like wanting to genuinely connect with someone, whereas cold seduction is more about just seeing them as a target to be won over.
Exactly.
Hmm.
And he argues that warm seduction is actually a much more effective and sustainable way to exert influence.
Okay, I'm starting to see where he's going with this. So how does this warm seduction actually play out in real life?
One of the key takeaways here, and I think this applies even outside of, romantic contexts, is what Green calls being outer directed. It's about being truly present in your interactions, making the other person feel heard and seen.
Which sounds so simple, right? But how often are we really fully present in a conversation, especially these days when everyone's so distracted?
That's the thing, it's deceptively simple. But I think Green is really getting at the heart of what it takes to be truly influential. Because when you can connect with someone on that level, when you can make them feel like they're the only person in the room, that's where real influence happens.
So it's not about some Jedi mind trick. It's about cultivating this sense of presence, of genuinely caring about the other person and what they have to say.
Exactly. And I think that takes us to this idea of confidence, which, as you said earlier, isn't something you can just willpower your way into.
So we're talking about genuine confidence, not just like putting on a show. But how do we actually build that? Because let's be real, we've all heard the fake it till you make it advice a million times, but how helpful is that really?
Yeah, it's definitely one of those easier said than done things. And you know what? Green actually kind of calls BS on that whole fake it till you make it mentality. He's got this idea of having a record, which I think is really interesting.
Having a record. Okay, I like the sound of that already. Tell me more.
So Green's view is that true, lasting confidence, it doesn't come from like puffing yourself up or pretending to be someone you're not.
Yeah.
It comes from genuine accomplishment, from having a track record of, facing challenges and coming out the other side.
So it's about stacking up wins, big or small, and building that solid foundation. Okay, that makes a lot of sense.
Exactly. It's that feeling of, I've done this before, I can do it again. And I think it goes back to what we were talking about earlier with that whole outer directed thing.
Yeah.
The more we're focused on external validation, the more insecure we actually become. But when we invest in ourselves, when we develop real skills, when we achieve things, that's where true confidence comes from.
It's like, remember how you were saying you used to read all those pickup artist books, but still felt insecure? Imagine if instead of memorizing those lines, you'd spent that time like learning an instrument or mastering a new language.
Right?
That sense of accomplishment, that record you'd be building, that would probably do wonders for your confidence, wouldn't it?
Absolutely, because
Yes.
it's not about trying to project some image of who you think you should be. It's about becoming the most authentic, capable version of yourself.
And that actually makes me think about what Green says about body language, too. It's not something you can just fake, right?
Exactly. Green talks about how body language is this primal language we've developed over millennia. It's hardwired into our brains.
It's like we instinctively read those subtle cues even if we don't realize we're doing it, which is why first impressions are so powerful.
Right. And he tells this really fascinating story about Milton Erickson, a psychologist who actually became a master of body language after being paralyzed by polio.
Wait, seriously, how is that even possible?
I know it's kind of mind-blowing, right?
Nice.
But because Erickson couldn't rely on his own movements or words, he became incredibly attuned to observing the body language of others.
So he turned that limitation into this incredible strength. Wow.
Exactly. And it really just goes to show that sometimes our greatest weaknesses can become our greatest strengths.
So what's the takeaway for those of us who haven't, experienced that level of enforced observation?
I think the key takeaway here is to stop overthinking every little gesture. You don't need to become a body language expert overnight. The most important thing is to focus on cultivating genuine confidence from the inside out, and your body language will naturally reflect that.
It's like that saying, be yourself, everyone else is already taken. Except in this case, it's like, be confident because you've earned it.
Exactly. It's about shifting our focus from trying to project an image to actually building that foundation of real hard-earned confidence, and that's what's going to make a lasting impact.
So we're building confidence, not faking it. But how does this all connect to Greene's book, Mastery? It seems like everyone's always talking about finding your passion. Is that really the key?
You know, it's funny how that's become like the holy grail of, well, everything. But Greene actually pushes back on that a bit. He uses the example of Stevie Wonder.
Yeah.
Like, nobody would deny that Stevie Wonder is a musical genius, right?
Yeah.
But Greene's point is that it wasn't just like raw talent.
Yeah.
It came from hours and hours of practice, scales, all the stuff most people would consider, kind of tedious.
So you're saying passion is overrated. What's my lazy self supposed to do with that information? But seriously, for someone trying to figure out their career path, it can feel like everyone else has this whole passion thing figured out?
It's easy to feel that way, for sure.
Yeah.
But this is where I think Greene's advice on the apprenticeship phase is really valuable. He talks about how early on in your career, it's more important to prioritize learning than a big paycheck.
So like choosing the path of most resistance.
Exactly.
Yeah.
It's about seeking out those roles where you're going to be challenged, where you're going to learn by doing, even if it means starting at what feels like the bottom.
So instead of being like a tiny cog in some massive machine, you're better off at, say, a smaller company where you can actually get your hands dirty and learn the ropes.
Exactly. Greene would probably say you're better off at that scrappy florist where you're actually learning the business than being lost in the corporate machine at, like, some fancy department store.
Okay, I'm with you. So we've got confidence from competence, a healthy dose of embracing the grind. But we also have to talk about Greene's stroke, right? I mean, that had to be a huge reality check on just how fragile everything is. How does he reconcile that experience with this whole power and strategy thing?
It's incredibly powerful the way he talks about it.
Mm-hmm.
He talks about how, at first, there was this delusion that he just bounced back,
Mm-hmm.
and then came the crushing depression when he realized the extent of his limitations.
I can't even imagine. So how did that experience actually change his views?
It's interesting. He still finds a lot of joy in writing, calls it his greatest source of power, but he also relies heavily on meditation. Says it's non-negotiable for his mental state. And here's the really fascinating part. He doesn't feel sorry for himself. He actually said he pities those of us who take our abilities for granted.
Wow. Talk about a perspective shift.
Right. It really makes you appreciate what you have while you have it. And actually highlights something else that's really crucial in all of this. Human connection. Greene talks about how important his wife's support was during his recovery, which I think is a good reminder that even the most, strategic, independent people, we all need love and support.
Absolutely. Speaking of support, last time we asked listeners a question, right? When were you most happy in adulthood and why? Are you that way now, and if not, why? Did Greene actually answer that himself?
He did. And it was actually pretty revealing. He said that the euphoria of achieving success early in his career, after years of struggle, that was a type of happiness he'd never experienced before. Of course, over time, that initial intensity has faded, but he still finds happiness in, like, knowing where he came from. you know?
It's like those early wins hit different because you really earned them.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And it's interesting because he also talked about how his work has made him more empathetic, but not necessarily optimistic about humanity.
Oh. So what gives him hope?
He actually sees young people with their rebellious spirit as a glimmer of hope. It's like they haven't become jaded yet.
Yeah, they still believe they can change the world, and maybe they will. Who knows? That's something to think about for sure. But for you listening, we'll leave you with this. What's something in your life that you might be taking for granted? How would your perspective shift if that thing were suddenly gone? Think about that one. Until next time, happy diving.